welcome to the discussion of the 9th commission in the Apollo Chamber Players 20 by 2020 commissioning project. I am here with the 4 members of the Apollo Chamber Players, Matt, Annabelle, Whitney and Matthew, and we're also joined by the composer of the 9th commission, which is titled 4 Dreams. That's Christopher Walczak. Matt, let us know how this commission came about.
Thank you, St.John. We wanted to do a program theme based on creation stories. One of the pieces that we ended up premiering actually in this particular program called Ex Nihilo, which translates to out of nothing, was a new chamber orchestrated version of Haydn's creation. So we covered the Christian creation story. We also programmed Mio's La Création du Monde, and this was for octet with some really special guest artists. So we were covering African creation myths. And then we learned a little bit about Australian Aboriginal creation myth of Dreamtime, and this really piqued our interest. So after some research, we decided that this could be a really cool addition to this particular program. And we actually have Nana Booker, who is the director of the Booker Gallery of Australian Aboriginal Art here in Houston, Texas, which I think houses the largest Aboriginal art collection outside of Australia. We have her to describe a little bit more about the concept of Dreamtime and Aboriginal culture.
Aboriginal culture is the oldest living culture in the world. The Indigenous people of Australia have inhabited the island continent for more than 50,000 years. So think about that. A never-ending civilization for 50,000 years before colonization and interruption of culture. In those thousands of years, spread across a country as large as the continental United States, there were hundreds of different indigenous tribes, and many of them had a lot in common. If they were desert people, they understood how critical it was to know where to find water anytime there was a drought. If they were coastal people, they had to learn to cope with too much water, even though they had a plentiful food supply. If they happened to live along the coastline, when the first British settlements were made, then they had to deal with encounters with a hostile nation encroaching on territory that they had lived on and felt responsible for, but did not feel they owned for thousands of years. In an oral culture, everything has to be handed down in a multiplicity of ways. So the Aboriginal people of Australia handed their mythology down not through a written language as we understand it, but through dance and storytelling and ceremony, body adornment, sand drawings, cave drawings, lots of visual elements, but just not a specific written language as we understand it. The desert people in particular had no encounters with outsiders until several hundred years ago. And in fact, there were several people who had no encounters with outsiders until the 1980s, if you can imagine that. But St.John asked me to talk about the 2 paintings that flank the stage today. And I just want to give you a very brief introduction to what these mean. They're dreaming stories, that is, they're creation stories, and for Aboriginal people, the creation era never ended. So rather than a linear philosophy of creation, theirs is more circular, and the anthropomorphic beings that roamed the earth during the creation era are still out there, and they could still come in. And there are some wonderful stories about that we could spend all night talking about. But the 2 stories that are reflected in these paintings are a night dreaming on my right, your left, and a desert dreaming story. So if I could just start quickly with the desert dreaming, it's a Mina story. For those of you who have been to Australia or who remember your geography and know that Alice Springs is roughly center of the continent, if you go about 200 miles northwest of Alice Springs, you come to a community of Walpuri people. So that's a tribal group, and they live in a community called Yuendamu. And there are probably 800 or 1,000 people there. The population varies at different times. If you go another 75 or 100 miles away, you're in Mina country. It's a very special place to the Walpuri people, as every tribe, every group has special sites, sacred sites, where stories occurred. And Mina has to do with the movement of water. So the movement by anthropomorphic beings, picking up storms, moving them to another place, creating lakes, and this kind of thing. Remember that about desert people. They have to know where to find water. So many of their dreaming stories have to do with the location, with lakes that exist and sometimes dry up, and how they were created, and where that water goes when they can't see it anymore.
So how does this tie into the idea of dream?
Well, it's not a dream as we think of it, St.John. So dreaming is our Western word for what Aboriginal people would call Jakurpa. So it's really their mythology, it's their culture, so their creation stories. And we just gave it the name Dreamings because we didn't really know how to pronounce Jakurpa most of the time, and weren't sure what else we could call it.
And this one over here.
And this one, and I know that we don't have a lot of time, but this is the story of the Pleiades from an Aboriginal point of view, from the Walpuri people point of view. And it involves 7 sisters. You see them represented at the bottom of the painting by the white circles, who are being pursued by a magician, a Jakamara man, and these girls are not supposed to have anything to do with him. So as the story goes, he stalks them. They keep trying to elude him, and there's a lot more to the story, but very quickly, they end up at Uluru, or Ayers Rock, which is the great sandstone monolith that's the red heart of Australia and the most sacred site for Aboriginal people. So the girls end up there. They see the pursuer still coming after them, and at this point, the stories vary a little bit, but they are catapulted into the sky by the spirits, where they become the Pleiades. But wait a minute, the Jakamara man is a magician, and so he's still in pursuit of these young women. He cast himself up into the sky, but he is forever stuck in Orion's belt, so he can never catch them. So the dreamings have moral stories as well, and that helps keep the young people informed as to who should have a relationship with whom and how to avoid getting themselves into trouble.
Nana Booker, the former honorary consul of Australia here in Houston, talking there about the Aboriginal concept of Dreamtime. And we go straight to the horse's mouth now, I guess, and talk to Christopher Walczak. Chris, how did you approach writing this work that you titled For Dreams?
Well, first of all, hello, Matt, Matthew, Whitney, and Annabelle. It's really good to see you again, especially good to see you, St.John, after some time. I was thrilled and honored that Apollo included me in their 20 by 2020 series. It was just a wonderful experience. Of course, I know the Apollo Chamber players. I lived in Houston and associated with them and consider them my friends. So it was really a thrill to work with people who you know and you love to work with. And it's a piece that I'm very, very fond of. Composers aren't always fond of every work. I'm so fond of this. You might notice that that's not a Zoom background behind me. I was so fond of the piece that I painted my wall with the score. So, well, Matt approached me and he said, "Hey, we're doing this piece and we're doing creation stories. And is there a way to get this into music?" And of course, as composers, you know this. It's always, well, I could turn that into music somehow, whether it comes across as one thing or another. But so I started delving into Indigenous Australian Aboriginal folklore and culture to the best of my knowledge. It's as we just heard, it's very difficult for non-Aboriginals to understand this. It's a deep concept. So dealing with Dreamtime was tricky to understand. It's this term that sort of describes important spiritual beliefs of their existence from creation, from this way back time. And I mean, I think she said 50,000 years, but I think some people say 65,000 years, the earliest Dreamtime stories go back to, which is just wild. And in these stories, these ancestors, she said, anthropomorphic beings, were responsible for creating the world as we know it, the water, the air, and the land of the sea. And it struck me that it was a creation story like many creation stories we hear, but it was very special to them, and it seemed like a very deep connection to the creation of this world. It was worth looking at. How to get that into music? Well, one of the first things I did was, what struck me was that being awake in this culture, in this in the Dreamtime concept, being awake and being asleep are two different realms. And the Indigenous Aboriginal people considered the dream state to be more of an important and real state, where the messages from their ancestors could come to them more clearly. And the real world was a little bit less. It was more full of noise and more full of sort of tainted things. So I had to try to get that across in the piece. And I did that by creating two separate languages. One was a harmonic language that was very close to tonal or modal music, which represented the awake, and then a very abstract language that represented dream language.
How does that play out in the various parts of the score?
Well, each movement begins with what we would say music from being conscious and awake and not in a dream state. And before long, each of the movements takes a turn into the dream state. And it's usually it's always one of the four of them that takes the lead and sort of has the motive, or has sort of the turning point where you start to lapse into this other consciousness. So I wanted to give each player the chance to do that, to sort of weave in and out of those two planes.
How does your instrument transition from the real world to the dream world?
I would say in the first movement, we start with this kind of calm introductory material. And as we go into about a minute in, it starts really kind of devolving into a much more active and rhythmic and also passionate material. And then all of a sudden we're like in a completely different world. And I think that the listener will be able to tell when that happens pretty easily, actually.
And he does this in all of the instrumentation for each of the instruments, two violins, viola, cello. But I think it's important to maybe share with our viewers, there's something called extended techniques for string instruments. And these include pizzicato, or the plucking of the strings. So you'll hear a lot of that. And then also something that really creates a very eerie, otherworldly sound, which I think is perfect for the Dreamtime element, is called ponticello. And this is where we play really close to the bridge of the instrument, and it produces just what I described. So I think Chris, as a composer, uses these musical elements in his compositional toolbox to great effect.
Well, thank you, man.
Whitney, what about the violist's view on this? Do you get to transition from reality to dream?
I think that's every violist's reality, maybe, perhaps, no matter what the piece. Actually, I will answer that, St. John, but another extended technique that's also really cool that the listener will notice is the coleño with the stick. We play with the wood of our bows, and it sort of gives this kind of, I don't know, bones rattling kind of sound to the music in certain parts as well. I probably wouldn't be able to say specifically in my own music where it's going between the dream and reality, but somehow when I'm playing it, we all I think know when that has happened in a way. Just the like Chris said, the nuance, the musical and harmonic language has shifted and changed, and I think that it's a testament to his compositional style that it's not like a jarring kind of thing that kind of just goes into those different worlds, but through those harmonic changes and stuff, it's a really interesting piece, and we all get chances to shine and to take each other on this sort of this Dreamtime journey, if you will.
And I'd say that the writing is very equal between the four voices sort of throughout the whole quartet. And maybe one of the other things that the listener might latch onto is when the four voices are speaking sort of together, and the material is very similar. And then you'll find these moments where all the voices seem to be just going on their own, and the complexity of the different lines is really apparent. So I think, does that sort of coincide with the shift in the harmonic language, Chris?
It does, because the Dreamtime sort of phases of the three movements are more electric. They're more active than the sort of awake states, because I just feel like, I noticed a lot of things about my own dreaming, and that's that things that made perfect sense in the real world, right, didn't make sense when you're dreaming. And if you ever are like, someone talks in their sleep when they're dreaming, what they're saying makes no sense whatsoever. So there's a translation that goes on here. And for me, it's much more electric and much more dense and active when you're unconscious. So yes, Matthew, that does happen.
We have three movements in the piece, Chris, and I wonder if you could talk about these.
The first movement is really about creation. So it really is about the power and the force of creation through the concept of Dreamtime. And one thing that I did immediately I hit YouTube and I started listening to indigenous Aboriginal traditional music, and it's pretty wild. So each of the three movements has one authentic Aboriginal piece of music embedded in it as sort of a cell. And so movement one is about creation, and that motive, which I believe Matthew plays in the cello first near the beginning, represents that creative force, and it weaves its way in and out. The second movement is a testimony of dreaming, all humans. If some people don't remember their dreams, and some people remember an odyssey every single morning when they wake up. But I always marveled that how you could shift in one dream, it just almost immediately into a completely new scenario. Your dreams morph from one stage to a different stage, right? And different characters. So the second movement explores the morphing of from one segment into another as seamlessly as possible. And then the third movement is with the latter represents the electricity moving up and down between the two worlds, the exchange of energy between real world and Dreamtime world.
Why don't we go ahead and show our viewers here, or they can experience the original source material and then how you rendered them in your piece.
Well, we heard there some of the traditional Australian Aboriginal sounds that, Chris, you incorporated into your piece for Dreams. And thank you, Chris, and thank you to the 4 members of the Apollo Chamber Players. And now, let's enjoy the music.
Let's enjoy the music.
Thank you.